All right, Ryca fans, this is Ryan here. We have our build video for the 04 and up bolt-on hardtail bobber kit. This is a bolt-on kit just like all the Ryca kits. There'll be a little bit of cutting, a little bit of drilling, but absolutely no welding, and that's what separates us from everyone else. What you're going to have here is the build video. I'd recommend watching the build video in its entirety from start to finish if you're interested in getting the kit, or even if you've already purchased it. That'll give you an idea of what's happening, maybe some help you take notes and prepare for the build. It's a pretty simple build, but you definitely want to take note on particular items. But do understand, in the build video, what we're going to be doing is I'm not going to be talking about every single nut and bolt size. I'm going to be talking about just the overall build process. But in the notes, you'll see all the specific sizes of the bolts, what size to drill here, where to cut, measurements, and so forth. This way we can make updates as needed. This bike is a 2009 Sportster. You could do this kit conversion with 04 all the way to present, but the 07, 8, and 9 had a computer that needs to be mounted to the battery box, as you will see in the video. So here we started with an 09 1200C custom. It works with any Sportster model, and with our kit, this is what you'll end up with. You'll have the hardtail bobber, basically a custom bike, but you'll be able to do it yourself in the garage, and that's the beauty of the Ryca kits. First off, what we have is the bike. We'll put it up on a jack stand to get started, and we'll start the strip down process. You'll drain the oil out of the bike. You'll go ahead and take off the rear axle from the bike, and once you get the rear axle removed, take the belt off. You can also then take off the tire, get that out of the way. You can take the pulley off of the hub at this point as well, removing the 5 bolts. They're pretty tight, so just be careful. You can use a little heat if needed. You can take the shocks off, take off the axle adjusters. Those are going to be the in the back there. You can take off the air filter box, the stock box if you have it. Basically we're stripping it down at this point. This bike came with some aftermarket exhaust, so you'll go ahead and pull that off. If you have the factory exhaust, it's pretty much the same thing. Just unbolt all the exhaust from the bike, get that out of the way. And a lot of this stuff can be sold, for profit. Here's the sprocket cover. We're going to take that off. Here what we have is the mid controls. Let's get those off, and we can take those out of the way. We don't have to remove them completely. Here's the passenger pegs. We'll take those off. And here is the swing arm. We're going to unbolt that. That's pretty simple. Just take the bolt out, get the swing arm out of the way. And next we'll take off the rear fender. We'll take off the oil cover from the oil tank, and we'll take off the top. We're going to take off the entire oil tank. Since the oil is drained now, we're going to unbolt the oil tank completely. Here's another bolt you have to remove to get the oil tank off. Next, there's a couple hoses. We're going to want to take these clamps off with a snip. So with the wire snips, you can take these clamps off pretty simply. And once you get those clamps off, as shown in the photos, you can get the oil tank out of the way. Here's a shot of the battery as well. You can get that out. Next, you can unbolt all the electronics from the frame right here. And there's a couple hidden bolts down at the bottom. There's an Allen bolt here that you need to take off in order to get the that out. And then over here there's another bolt between the frame rails. Nothing too complicated, but then this bracket comes out and out of the way. Now basically you're exposed to the triangle, and here's your brake light. Make sure you label everything. That's a good idea, to label your turns, label your brake light. I mean, those are basically the only pieces you're going to be labeling, but it's important. So with the hardtail, obviously you need to cut the rear section off the frame. We're going to be cutting it here at this weld, and we're also going to be cutting it on the opposite side at the same weld. And then up top, we're going to be cutting it across the cross member, basically getting rid of the shock tower. Of course, this is what you do with a weld on hardtail, and it's what you'll do with a Ryca kit. You're going to enlarge these holes here and here, and those are the mounting points for the upper point of the hardtail. We're going to put some tape down. We're going to cut across the frame rail at the bottom of this tape. Now, note, that's the bottom of the tape is where we're going to cut. We're going to take off basically right where the two frame rails come together, and then at the bottom at the weld seam is where the tape is. We're going to cut that point as well. So when you're getting ready for cutting, you need to basically pull everything out of the way. You're going to want to just expose the frame that you're going to cut. So what I like to do is cover the rest of the bike in like a shop blanket or a moving blanket, tape it up, get everything exposed that you want to cut, and nothing else that you want. Don't damage anything with the with the cutting from the die grinder and that sort of thing. Here it is, just another shot of the bike. Here it is cut. You can use a 4.5-inch die grinder and a flapper disc to cut and clean up the cuts that you've made. Next, we'll be cleaning these up later with a die grinder. Here you can see I cut them a little long, and that's going to help let you fine-tune them with your die grinder. Here they are cleaned up a little bit with the die grinder, and you'll see later in the video that we're going to clean them up even further. Here they are as well, cut and cleaned with the die grinder and the 4.5-inch. Next, we're going to install the Ryca motor mounts. These are urethane-filled motor mounts, similar to a stock motor mount, but much more solid. If you use the standard motor mounts, your engine's going to move too much, and you'll get chain slap. So basically, we're going to install these in place of the original motor mount. You don't want to be able to lose. You want to lose your chain. These rubber mount engines, the Sportster engine, it'll move quite a bit and jump, and you can risk losing your chain. So it's a must that you replace these. So down on the lower port of the motor mount, so we're going to take off the left front motor mount first. A couple Torx bits, no big deal. Take that out, get out of the way. It's good to support the engine with a jack when you're doing this. It'll kind of keep the pressure off. Take that front support out of the way, and you'll see the motor mount now is exposed, shown here. And you can go ahead and just take that front left motor mount out. Just make sure the jack is supporting the weight of the engine. Next, you're going to take out the. You can take off the front motor mounts. Those are the up top at the engine, at the head of the cylinder head, and then at the bottom there's another front motor mount. There's 2 bolts on the upper one, and then here you can see I've removed them. And then on the lower motor mount, there's a couple Torx bits here. You can get rid of those 2 bolts and off the frame. You could even take it off here at the dog bone. I find the 2 at the front are easier to take off, and right here as shown in this picture. To let the engine move, because you're going to have to wiggle this engine a bit to get these motor mounts out. So next, here's the 2 bolts for the rear motor mount. We're going to basically remove that on the back, and that's going to allow the rear motor mount to be exposed. Now, once that's exposed, you can take the rear rubber motor mount out. I like to use a jack also on the side to kind of take the support of the engine. You don't want it flopping over. That motor mount will come out pretty easy at that point. I also like to, now we're going to have to move this engine a bit, take off this plastic cover, trim some of these zip ties out of the way so you can get this plastic cover to the side, because you're going to be moving this engine around a bit. Some of the connectors may have to be unplugged as well. Once you get the jack out of the engine, you're going to basically move this engine around a bit to try and get these right motor mounts. Now, they're tricky. It's good to use a screwdriver or a pry bar, and protect the engine in order to pry that top, upper, front motor mount out, and you can get it out pretty well. The trickier one is the rear one. The right rear is the more difficult. I like to take the mid-control off to get it out of the way, and then make sure the engine's pretty well supported, because obviously 3 out of 4 motor mounts are now missing. So on the opposite side, left rear, you're going to go ahead and take the 3 bolts off of this this main shaft here. This is what holds the rear of the motor mount to the engine. So once you get those bolts off, pull the shaft right out the left-hand side, and then you'll see the motor mount is now basically exposed. We just have to get that engine out of the way in order to get that. So I like to use a pry bar, gently wiggle the engine, and use the jacks to your advantage. As you can see here, now I'm sliding the motor mount up and out on the side. There it is coming out, and then finally you'll be able to kind of get it out. And putting the new ones in are going to be in the reverse order. So now that motor mount's out, here's the original motor mounts that are out. We're going to replace them with the Ryca urethane-filled motor mounts. Now these are going to stiffen up that engine. I like to use, to get that first one in, like a wood block, and you can tap the wood handle, like a rubber mallet works well. You can tap that first motor mount into place. Once it's down in, it'll set in place on the frame. Then you're going to go ahead and do the right front motor mount. Same kind of process, just the reverse of the original. It's a little tight. You're going to have to pry it a little bit and get that engine over to the side, but you won't have to take the engine completely out. It's definitely doable. It just takes a little finesse. Once that motor mount is down and in place, Now you're ready to go on the other side of the bike. So as you see here, the motor mount's in place on the engine. The jack is still supporting the engine. Now we're going to go around to the reverse. The left side motor mounts are much easier, same as before. Reverse the steps as we did. We took the front motor mount, basically the axle mount, put it around the motor mount, put the bolt through, tighten the bolt up as shown here, and then we'll put the frame mounts back on when we're done. So here's the motor mount being tightened from both sides, and then on the left-hand front now, you're going to tighten up the two original Torx bolts to hold that motor in place up front. Sometimes I like to leave it a little loose as I'm getting the last rear motor mount in to give you a little wiggle room, but you'll see, once you get to this point, it's really not that difficult. Now that shaft goes back in through the engine, and then the original 3 bolts and the plate goes back on, so you reattach that. Remember to use Loctite on all of these. This is very important as well. That shaft is in, the bolts go back in, and now that fourth and final motor mount will go in place. So here it is. You attach it to the piece of metal, the original frame section, then bolt it up into the engine with the shaft sticking through the original hole. Then go ahead and reattach, retighten your front motor mounts, those 4 bolts that you took off to get the engine to move. Now you should be able to tighten those back in place and get that engine firmly installed as it was originally. Okay, the next step, we're going to level the Sportster out. So if you don't have a motorcycle lift, you can just use a couple of 4x4s and 2x4s. The beauty of the Sportster is the underside is super flat, so you can level it pretty well with blocks. And as you can see from this side, I've stuck the kickstand in between the blocks, got it nice and level, and we're going to use this to start doing measurements. So here we're going to open up this hole here, the front hole, not the rear, the one that's round. We're going to do that on both sides. We're going to open those up. You can use the bit, or a step bit works well. Just make sure there's enough space in between the steps to clear the thickness of your metal. Here I've marked the step bit so I don't go too far. And I'm going to open that up. And like I said, all the measurements of the bolts and all that stuff will be in the notes at the as you're seeing this video scrolling. You're going to see notes for all bolt sizes and whatnot. Here's all the hardware that's going to be used, the main hardware to attach the hardtail. These are grade 9 mil-spec bolts, so it's very important that you use these to mount the hardtail. Here's the slugs that hold the lower portion of the frame. Once we've opened the top part of the frame up, the upper portion of the hardtail can be attached. You're going to use these temporary black zinc nuts to attach the hardtail on the top. The reason we're using those is because that grade 9 mil-spec bolts can only be used once. So here we're tightening up those black phosphate nuts in the back side of these bolts, just snugging them to get it in place. You can use a jack on the back with the original axle to kind of level the hardtail. This is going to be leveled so that we can find the point to attach the lower portion of the hardtail. Here's where we're going to be drilling. Now make sure there's a gap where you can see my finger between the kickstand rubber bounce and the hardtail. You're going to leave about 3/8 to a ½ inch of gap. That's important. Here's where you can take an angle finder to make sure you're getting really close, but we're going to fine tune it with some measurements in a minute. So you can see the bolts are now in place, the slugs are now in place between the frame and the hardtail. And you can see the grade 9 bolts here sticking out. Now that the slugs are in place between the frame and the hardtail, you're going to go ahead and drill some of these out. So here's a shot from the back. The hardtail's in place, the angle finder's on, and we're going to take some measurements first before we start drilling this. Now you can measure here from the front of this motor mount. That's a nice firm point to the rear of the hardtail. Now the measurement is important, but more importantly is the measurement from left to right. You want to make sure there's no difference between the left and right points. Now here you can see on the axle plate is where I'm measuring, where the gusset on the axle plate and that motor mount meet should be the same left and right. It should also be the correct measurement that I'm going to give you below. So once that's in place, you got the correct gap, the measurements on the left and right hand sides match, then we can go ahead and drill the lower hardtail frame bolts out. So what we're going to do then, here's just another shot of the jack holding the axle if you need it to be held at that point. Make sure there is that gap between the rubber bushing. I'm just emphasizing that now. So here the bolts are in place on both sides. you can see that the bolts I have placed on the left side and the right side are going through. The reason we're doing that is it's holding the spacer in place while we're going ahead and drilling it. So the spacers are in place, the bolts are in place, the washers are in place. We're just doing that now. So we can pull out now one bolt, replace it with the drill bit, and go ahead and drill through our 4 motor mounts. We're going to do the first one on the front right. Once we get through that one with the drill bit, you'll need to remove the second bolt to get the end of the drill bit through. That's just so it doesn't hit the bolt. Once that's through, you can put the bolt in place, and we're going to do the other side front. So now the left-hand side, we're going to drill that out with the 3/8 drill bit. We're going to go through. At the very end, you'll have to obviously remove that second bolt so that the drill can go all the way through, as shown here. Once we've drilled out that second left-hand side, we'll go ahead and do the right-hand side again, now the rear this time. Once we drill that through, as you can see here, through the slug, all the way through the frame, nice and level, we can replace it with the grade 9 bolt. And then finally, we get that 4th bolt on the left-hand side. We're going to drill that one as well. Now here's an underside shot of the bike. You can see all 4 bolts kind of sticking through, that 4th drill bit coming through. Now you have all 4 bolts in place. Everything's level. So now we can focus on mounting some of the other hardware. Here's the lower battery box mount. So what this does is it goes and fills those 2 lower frame cuts that you made. If it doesn't quite go in, you're going to need to file out the inside of the frame a bit. You can also use a Dremel or an air tool to clean out that inside of that frame. That'll allow that piece to go in. It may be good to get this kit not powder coated so that you can make some of these adjustments without damaging the powder coat. You can see here it's in, but even though it is in, you still may have to do some fine tuning once the battery box and the oil can go in. Here we put the rubber mounts in. As you can see, my frame is not powder coated, and that allows me to make these adjustments. Here my oil can, has not quite made it under the upper frame tab mount. So we want to make sure that these tabs can make it underneath those tabs. So instead of shaving the oil can, what we want to do is continue to shave that lower frame. Here you can see I have a little bit left to trim on the inside edge of that, and this will allow that to go all the way down until the oil can be mounted in place. You can attach the oil can now with the included hardware in the top. Make sure you go through the rubber bushings and the sleeves, and then the lower point can be mounted with the same bolt as well. Now in this photo, you're going to see the battery box is attached on the upper point here, and then at the lower point there's a slot. Here it shows a bolt, but your battery box will have a slot, allows for some adjustability in the battery box placement. Next, we'll be attaching the fender. So the fender is going to go on, sitting on top of the fender. You're going to then mark it on the top of the fender here on the front. You're going to take a Sharpie and go ahead and mark the front of the fender. And you're going to want to go ahead and drill the front out before you do all 4. So drill the front with the appropriate size drill bit shown here. Clean those drill holes up. It's a thin fender. You want to make sure that does nice and clean. I like to shave them with a little roll-lock disc. And then go ahead and stick your hardware in place. I like to tape it from the underside of the fender, the bolts, so that the acorn nuts are on the top. This allows more tire clearance. Next, we'll go ahead and do the rear fender strut. Attach it at the bottom. Swing it. Now, you can either attach this at the top of the fender or you can attach it below the fender. I have it here on the top of the fender, but you can do it underneath to allow a little more tire clearance. If you're running the rear taillight, it's nice to have a little extra tire clearance. But here I'm go ahead and mark those 2 points on the fender. If you did on the underside, you'll just have to take the tire off to mark it. Drilled it out and put the bolts in as shown. Then I go ahead and attach the acorn nuts here, bolted into place, basically as it will be in the final product. And here's a shot of the fender mounted to the frame. Next, we're going to add a second bolt to this upper gusset for strength. We're going to drill basically 1.5 inches from the original bolt, centered up on the frame rail, and we're going to drill through that. Starting with a pilot bit, you want to start these small and then build your way up. Measure 1.5 inches, center it up, drill yourself a hole through both sides of the frame rail. This is going to give you a little extra strength on the upper mount. And it's important to do this with the second bolt so that you have that strength. As you see in the center, there's a weld here. We're going to drill that out, and that's going to be the point of attachment for the seat hinge. So it's good to start with a pilot bit. You can center the seat hinge up to see how it's going to mount, and then drill that out as shown here in these shots. Just another overview. We drilled the right-hand side out now, finished it off with the pilot bit. Now we're at the 3/8 bit on both sides, and we finished that out. So we're not going to tighten this hardware up completely yet. We still have those black phosphate nuts up underneath, and these bolts are now lined up. We're not going to snug everything completely down yet. We can get it finger tight, but not completely snug. As you can see now, I'm doing the final assembly process. Everything's been powder coated and now is going in for reassembly. So some of this is an overview, but I like to do it this way so that you can not damage anything as you're building it originally. So here the gussets, the bolts are going in snugly through the holes. They're in through the points on the frame. You can see them here underneath. You can see the half round slugs. You can now put in that second bolt, the grade 9 mil-spec bolt. Go ahead and tighten that up. And like I said, we're not going to tighten these up completely until the end. Once everything is in place, then we're going to snug these up with a torque wrench. If you decide to use our rear taillight, which you don't have to, you can use a side mount or any taillight of your choice. You're just going to mark it as shown, the 3 holes. You're going to mark those with a Sharpie, and then I like to take the fender off, obviously, so you don't damage the tire. And then I like to drill a 4th hole up here for the wiring if you're going to run the wire under the fender. Now, you don't have to, but this is just the way I do it. Then I like to open up the existing hole on the fender at the bottom to run the wire back in towards the bike. Here you can see our L bracket. This is going to attach to the battery box, and this is going to hold the brake line in place. I marked that on the battery box as well. That'll be a spot where we're going to drill out to 3/8 to hold that tab in place to secure the brake line. As you can see here, if you have an 07 to 09 model, you're going to need to attach the computer here to the side of the battery box. Go ahead and mark that with a scribe or a Sharpie. Get it in place. And you want to do this before powder coat as well. So this is a little jumped out of place, but you get the idea. You want to make sure you watch this video in entirety before you build. So here we got the Sharpie in place. We're marking that computer points. Drill 2 holes out to get that going. So this is an overview. This is the battery box lower. It's in place now as it's powder coated. You can see now I've tapped it into place in the slugs. Those 3 rubber bushings that hold the oil can in place now can go on. So you're going to put those 1 on the bottom, 2 on the top as shown here on the finished powder coated frame. Here we have the lower battery box. You'll see a hole at the bottom, but in yours will be slotted to allow for some adjustment. Those 2 bolts will now get put in. The oil can now go on with the supplied 3 hardware through those rubber bushings. Here we have the 2 upper bolts, and down here we have the lower bolt. And at this point we can start now tightening up the hardtail. Now those mil-spec bolts can only be tightened once. You'll notice the ovaled nuts are actually lock nuts that can't be loosened and reused. So now we're going to go ahead and tighten that down with a torque wrench on all 8 bolts. So we'll do the uppers. You want to stagger, go left, right, back and forth, up, down. So you want to make sure you don't just do one side first. You want to go back and forth to tighten all those down. Now we're going to take off the front belt pulley. We'll get these off with the 2 Allen heads, take off the lock washer, remove that, and then you can go ahead and remove the sprocket as well. Know that the sprocket is attached with reverse threads. You have a 1 7/8 socket, and I have my finger here for reference. These are reverse threads, so you can hit that with an impact or a torque wrench. Put the bike in gear, take the nut off, take the original belt pulley off, get it out of the way. We're going to then, on the rear, you can start fitting up your rear axle mounts. Those are the original axle adjusters from the Sportster. We're going to go ahead and put the rear sprocket on. You can see its dish. The dish now faces out on the rear wheel. So the dish here, as you can see in the photo, will face out. First, we're going to attach the Ryca proprietary rear spacer. Now, this is going to line up the chain conversion. You put that, if it's real tight, it's supposed to be. You can slightly take off the edge with a file, and you're going to want to tap that down with a rubber mallet. It is supposed to be tight. Once that is in place, put the sprocket on. That will center up on the ring on the wheel. Tighten that down with the original hardware. 2 spec, torque that in place with Loctite on all of these bolts. That's basically getting the rear wheel done. We're going to jump ahead. Now this next step is optional, but this bike is lower than the back with our hardtail 2 inches. So a lot of people like to lower the front. We have this socket available on our site if you want to take it off. Otherwise, you can just use a standard socket. Get those front fork tube caps off if you want to use our progressive front lowering spring kit. Here we have the extended dyno risers available on our site. We're installing the lowering kit up front, which is available on our site. You put the springs in. This is the progressive lowering springs. Then you put in the spacer or washer, and then you put in the preload spacers, which are included also with that lowering kit. This gives the bike a 2-inch drop. Now, if you want to lower it out completely level and you have a standard Sportster, not a low model, you can also raise your fork tubes up a bit. Now, you don't have to do this, but we decided to go ahead and lower the fork tubes about 1 to 2 inches as well to give it that slammed look. So we're going to go ahead and slide the fork tubes up in the triple trees, lower and upper, slide them up a couple inches. You get that really low front end. Here we're taking out the original oil line, getting it out of the way. We're going to start marking our oil lines for reassembly. Here you can see the 3 oil lines out of the engine, and this is in the factory position, so I went ahead and marked them and took a shot here so you can see which one is the vent line, which one's the feed, and which one's the return. We're going to attach the fittings included with the kit to the new oil can, as shown here in this shot. And then we're going to cut the vent line on the top a little bit to attach the hoses that we get. So now the return line on the top obviously is going to go to the top of the can. The 2 fittings here are going to extend the original other 2 hoses. So we have the vent line on the top and the feed line on the bottom. You're going to extend those 2 with our fittings. Attach hose clamps here and here. And then here you're going to use the oil line included with the kit to attach the factory oil lines to the new oil can. So here, as you can see, we've then extended the original return line, the feed line, and the return line, and the vent line. So the return line has been extended as well, and the feed line on the bottom. And here's the finished product. Put the hose clamps on so that it reaches the new spot on the oil can. Here is optional. We're going to run the electrical for the taillight under the fender. Now, you don't have to do this, but I like to do it. It is a little risky because the tire can rub, so you want to make sure you run these real close to the fender. I like to run a little bit of the plastic conduit, and this basically holds it in place. You can use some adhesive. I like to use the SEM that we have on our site, but you can run basically a plastic, or you can run the wiring directly on the fender if you need extra clearance. You want to do this a section at a time. You don't want to do the whole thing at once. Once you do a portion, it hardens, then you can do the next point. This is the finished product. Once the wiring is tucked under the fender, then we can mount the taillight back onto the fender. We use some of the included foam, and you can make a few points for your since the fender is rounded and the taillight's a little bit flat, you can use a little bit of the supplied foam to attach it. Plus, it doesn't damage your paint at this point. Attach it with the included bolts and the acorn nuts, as shown here. Then we're going to attach the fender strut on the rear to the fender as we did before, basically just reattaching it as we did earlier. Here's the lower mount with the acorn nut and the button head, and then here's the upper mount with the acorn and the button heads. And then on the wiring of the taillight, we extend it back out. We're just going to match up the wires, shorten them, and solder them together with a little bit of heat shrink as shown here. So I go ahead and solder the 3 wires together, and then heat shrink them, and then do a master heat shrink on top of all 3. And then I usually use a little bit of the plastic conduit to cover the finished wires. But you can feel free to experiment and run your taillight how you please. By no means is this the only way you can do that. Then you want to run it to those original taillights you had marked on your connector, your factory connector. I solder them up. You can always check with a test light to make sure you have the correct wires, but it's good to mark those before you start. Make sure you know which one's taillight, which one's ground, which one's brake light, and also which are turns if you decide to run turns as well. So here I've heat shrinked it. Now we're going to attach the, here's the battery box finish point, but the brake rear caliper is the original OEM caliper from the Sportster. and it's just going to be reattached. So here you can see on the actual adjusters, the caliper, everything's in line. The spacers are back on where they originally were. And if you have an 07 to 09 model, and we showed you earlier how we drilled where the computer was on the battery box, I like to shave those bolts down. It gives me a little clearance on the bolts in the inside of that battery box to attach the computer. So once I shave those, I can attach the computer to the side of the battery box. And the reason this is important, you want to do this before you install the battery. Now the battery is installed, you can focus on the seat up above. So here we have the seat assembly, the included black leather solo seat, the hinge mount, which has now been powder coated, and we're going to attach that with the hardware shown there. Attach it in place. Make sure you use plenty of thread lock on this. Attach the hinge as shown with the shoulder bolts that are included. Then we have 4 bolts here. That's for the underside of the seat, and the 2-inch springs available in 3 colors, black, copper, or chrome. We've attached the springs down on the stems with the plastic washers in between, and here you can see that that bolt has been placed up in the spring with the washer and then attached to the seat from the underside. Make sure you use Loctite on that and on the underside of the hinge. That's really important. Keep that firmly in place. Here's the finished product with the pins in place, the clips in place on the springs, and next we're going to attach the brake line on the rear. Here I've got the brake line, the factory brake line. I'm going to mount it to that 90-degree tab included with the kit and the supplied hardware with the kit. Here it is attached to the top of the battery box and then to the brake line, factory brake line. If you have the computer mounted model, use 07 to 09, you can use the computer as a secondary mounting point for the brake line. As I'm doing here, I'm opening up the bracket, attaching the supplied hardware through the bracket, and the soft line is now in place. Here on the brake reservoir, you can attach with the with the factory bracket and our hardware. You can attach it to this point here on the bike. That is right next to the motor mount tab, and that'll hold the brake lines in place. And then here is the upper mount with our supplied hardware, can be mounted to the frame as well, so the reservoir is in place. And then you can, once it's attached, cover it with its factory cover, basically for a factory installed look on the brake fluid reservoir as well. Here we have the ground wires and power lines. You want to flip these around so that they're facing the battery. There's not quite enough length on the factory battery cables to where we replace the battery, but once you flip those around, you get enough extension on the battery cables to reach the battery. So here you can see I've flipped them around, and now I have enough length on my positive and negative battery terminals to reach my new location on the battery with the factory cables, so you don't have to rewire anything. Here's the front sprocket. We have 2 Ryca spacers that we've designed and a new front sprocket. So the first spacer goes on the original on the engine against the engine on the bearing. Then you're going to attach our sprockets on the sprocket itself, and then the secondary sprocket spacer. So basically the sprocket is sandwiched between 2 spacers, and this will align your chain perfectly. Attach the original nut, plenty of Loctite on this, and then remember it's reverse threads. Here we cut a link or 2 off the chain. You want to test your chain, make sure it's going to be the right length. We give you an extra length on the chain for this very reason. I'm also installing the optional chain tensioner. This is not necessary, but I like the chain tensioner for the simple fact that it allows me to place the rear tire where I want it, and then the chain tensioner takes up the slack instead of having the tire pull the chain tight and maybe not be optimal. You're going to have to shave a little bit on the frame. There might be some spots here like where the chain may rub on the upper battery box mount. Here on the lower motor mount on the right-hand side, that's going to have to be shaved off for the chain. Otherwise, it can rub that point as well. So that'll be cut down, shaved off. Here the chain's in place. I've put the master link on. Make sure you look at the box on the chain included so that your drive direction on the C-clip is installed correctly. And here you can see I've installed the chain tensioner flipped around backwards, holding the chain in place. And this will take up the slack so that I can make my rear wheel position, as shown here with the adjusters, exactly where I want it in the fender, instead of having to pull the chain tight. You know, sometimes it'll lie right between those 2 points on a chain, and you don't want to necessarily pull the tire back all the way. Here we're doing an optional air filter install. This is not required, but We do it because we run the high pipe exhaust. Here's the integral bracket that's on our site. This is also an option on the kit, as well as the Moon Eyes bracket that goes on top of it. And then you can install the air filter and chrome cover. We also have a Ryca air filter that will be an option as well. Here is the optional high pipe exhaust that comes with the kit. I like to install the C-rings and the clips and the O2 sensors now before I put it up onto the bike. Here you can see the retaining kit is on and the O2 sensors are installed. Then I'll go ahead and put that up on the bike itself, tighten the header clamps down, the retaining kit, and then once it's all positioned correctly, that's when you can go ahead and install the C-clips. The T-clamps, the C-clamps on the head, get that all firmed up in place, and then you can finish it off with the header wrap. Or you can also get the exhaust with the heat shields as well. So that's basically it. Here's the finished product. I know that was a little quick, but that's the install. I mean, it's not a super complicated build, but it's definitely very gratifying when you finish it. You're going to have that sense of accomplishment, and it's going to be all yours. I mean, this is a fully custom hardtail bobber bike that you would pay 3 times, 4 times, 6 times the money in a custom shop to do, and you're going to be able to do it yourself with hand tools. So I'll leave you with that. I hope you enjoy this kit as much as I enjoyed putting it together. We here at Ryca dedicated a long time to this kit. We really just love it, and we hope you do too. It's definitely going to be able to allow the average person to have a completely custom hardtail bobber and be able to build it, and with no expense spared. I mean, this is probably the coolest bobber kit that the average person is going to be able to put together, and I'm excited to offer it to you, and I'm just really excited that you'll be able to take advantage of this. So enjoy, stay safe, ride safe, and thank you once again. Ryca Motors thanks you.